Imagine you wake up and see a message you never expected. Your DNA was stolen, or worse, your father is not the man you thought he was. And this is not a movie twist, it's how the system works. A cousin takes a test, a relative turns on matching, and suddenly your private life can show up in a search because you can reset a password, you can replace a bank card, you can change your phone, but DNA can't be reset. And here is the part most people miss. In this world, consent spreads. Your privacy can change because someone else clicked yes. One upload doesn't only reveal them, it can reveal you too.
And there is a detail here that should feel cold. In multiple countries, government agencies have warned their personnel about consumer DNA tests, not because the science is bad, but because biology is the most convenient identifier on Earth. So here is the guiding question that will carry us through this whole film. When DNA becomes a consumer app, who actually owns the blast radius? And yet millions of people voluntarily mailed it to private companies for a $99 box and a beautiful map made of percentages. That is how family secrets stopped being one-generation secrets. They became data. If you watched the Netflix series Runaway, you'll recognize the nerve it touches. If you didn't, that's fine. This video is not a recap and not a review. This is a techno-legal documentary about the real mechanism behind at-home DNA tests, how they work, what they actually measure, and what happens when your biology becomes a corporate database you cannot reset. Now for the most peaceful scene where this whole story begins. Two sisters take the same DNA test. Same parents, same family tree. In theory, the same genetic story. And the results come back like this. One sister gets 10% France, the other gets 0%.
Okay, this is hilarious though, because look, French and German. What?
Oh, I don't have that.
You don't have that at all?
No.
If you've ever seen numbers like that, you already know the feeling. It's almost physical, as if the screen is showing you not statistics, but a verdict. This is who you are, this is where you're from. And there is a reason it hits so hard, and precise numbers read as confidence. A percentage feels like a measurement even when underneath it is probability, a model, and compromise. It's the effect of numerical precision. A digit sounds firmer than the word similar.
This is where the real story starts. Consumer DNA tests are powerful, but people misunderstand them all the time. They can bring families together, uncover secrets, and even help solve old crimes. But they can also make guesses feel like certainty. They are sold as roots, but in practice they work like infrastructure, with a database, an algorithm, and access rules.
There's another force at work here. People are drawn to it and scared of it at the same time. One person says, "I've always wanted to try one of these at-home DNA tests. It's cheap, why not?" Another says, "It freaks me out that a company would own my DNA." And in their own way, both are right. Because the entry ticket is designed like an impulse purchase, roughly $99 to a couple of hundred. A kit, a box, saliva, a courier, and then a clean interface a few weeks later. A map, percentages, a confident story. You need to get this fast. The risky part isn't the tube, it's the screen. Those percentages look exact, but they're often just a best guess. 10% France really means your DNA looks similar to a group the company built for comparison.
So let's start with the basic question. How it's even possible that two sisters with the same parents get different ethnicities?
Every person carries roughly 6 billion base pairs packed into 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes total. It sounds like an unimaginable amount of information, but another number matters more. More than 99% of the human genome is shared across all people. The differences are in the remaining fraction. And here's the next twist. Most commercial tests don't read your whole genome. They only sample a thin layer of it, like checking a few pages instead of reading the entire book.
Entire DNA is made up of 3 billion parts. Ancestry companies, though, look at less than 1% of those.
And that's because your DNA isn't an ID card with country labels stamped inside it. It's just sequences. The map and the country names are added later by statistics based on patterns and comparison groups. And your ancestry becomes complicated even before conception because sperm and egg do not carry half of a parent as a clean copy. They carry a unique remix. When the body turns a 46 chromosome cell into a 23 chromosome reproductive cell, each chromosome pair swaps segments. That process is recombination, which means every egg and every sperm is a unique build. Two sisters do inherit half their DNA from their mother and half from their father, yes, but which exact segments each one gets is different. So, the first cold conclusion is simple. Siblings will almost always have slightly different ancestry percentages. This is not magic, and it's not a system error. It is inheritance math. If recombination did not exist, you would receive exactly 1/4 from each grandparent, 1/8 from each great-grandparent, and so on. But recombination happens every generation, so those shares drift. The farther the ancestor, the higher the chance they are not represented in your DNA in any noticeable way. 6 generations back, ideally, would be 1/64th, but because of recombination, it can be higher, or it can be 0. That's why one sister isn't more French in the sense of having different ancestors. She is more French in only one sense. She randomly inherited more of the segments the algorithm associates with France.
But the story doesn't end there, because the test is not comparing you to your real ancestors from the 18th century. We don't have their genomes. The test compares you to people living today and to what the company defines as a reference. That's the key phrase, the reference panel.
Companies assemble groups of people who, through documents and family history, can trace their ancestry in a region back for many generations. That becomes the panel. Then the algorithm identifies markers, short sequences or combinations of markers, that statistically occur more often in that group. Next, your genome is sliced into segments. Each segment is compared to panels and assigned to the one it resembles most, and then those assignments are summed into percentages. Such a consumer DNA test did not begin from zero. Even the first user could get an ancestry estimate because it is not a comparison with other customers. It is a comparison with pre-built reference panels and a model. Your set of ES&P markers is matched against those panels, and the algorithm distributes your segments into categories. But relative matching is a different story. That only truly comes alive at scale because it isn't a model. It's a network of matches. If the database has no other people, there are no matches. The larger the database, the higher the chance you'll find someone, even a distant match. And that is why your ancestry map can change over time, because panels and algorithms change, while your list of relatives grows simply because the database grows. And here is a sobering mini-fact. The biggest services turned a DNA test into a mass network where the count is not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but millions and tens of millions of profiles. At a certain point, it stops being a database. It becomes a social graph, just built not on likes, but on kinship.
On paper, this sounds perfect. In reality, it's always a compromise. First, databases are uneven. For a long time, a large portion of profiles in these databases were on European descent. Many indigenous populations and entire regions are underrepresented. If a group isn't in the reference data, the test can't show those roots, even if they exist in your family history. Second, people never lived in a vacuum. Over centuries, populations moved, mixed, disappeared, and reappeared. The DNA of people who lived in a place 1,000 years ago can differ from people living in that place today. And political borders, of course, are not genetic borders.
So, ethnicity in a report is not a passport, not a certificate, and not proof of race. It's a statistical estimate of similarity to reference groups living today. That's why results change. If you once opened an app and saw you were 40% Swedish, and half a year later it became 5%, it's not because your DNA changed. It's because the map changed. A good metaphor is old geography maps. In 1520, a cartographer could draw the outline of America so you recognize the coastline, while everything else looks like fantasy. Not because the continent was different, but because the data was thinner and the interpretation rougher. The same is true of ancestry percentages. The more people test, the more reference panels exist, the better the algorithms get. The more one broad category gets split into narrower ones, and the more the model shifts percentages across neighboring regions. You thought it was your essence. It was a database update. And there's one more thing that matters. Most people confuse genetics and genealogy. Genealogy is documents, surnames, records, marriages, migrations, real family stories. Genetics is which specific DNA segments actually reached you through the randomness of recombination.
You can have a French surname and still show 15% French in the app. You can think your family is only from one place and still have mixed roots. That's normal because almost nobody is 100% anything. People have always moved, married, and mixed over time.
And here comes a paradox that breaks intuition. If you start counting ancestors by the textbook, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, then within 37 generations, you would have 137 billion ancestors in a single generation, more than the number of people who could ever have lived on Earth. So family trees do not grow like a perfect pyramid. They collapse. They repeat. Distant cousins are closer than you think. That phenomenon even has a name, pedigree collapse. And if you count genetic ancestors, those who actually passed you detectable DNA, the number becomes smaller still. Many distant ancestors leave you 0 noticeable fragments because genes do not pass through every ancestor. They pass through a small random sample.
So here are the real limits of the product. DNA tests are great for some questions and misleading for others. They work best for close matches, parents and children, full brothers and sisters. That signal is strong and clear. But the further back you go in time, and the more you try to point to a tiny place on a map, the less clear it becomes. It turns into similar, likely, or somewhere in the range.
And still, millions do it because the promise is almost impossible to ignore. You send a tube of saliva, and a few weeks later, you get a story back about your family, your roots, and sometimes even your health. It feels like a trick that shouldn't work, like you mailed a key to your most private book, and the app mailed you a new chapter about who you are. Sometimes that is exactly what happens. Sometimes the technology gives someone belonging back. A woman takes a test just to understand her roots. She ticks the box to show DNA relative matches, and then one day she gets a strong match. The system suggests a relationship around first cousins, about 1,641 centimorgans. A centimorgan is a unit used to describe the amount of inherited DNA segments shared. More shared segments usually means a closer relationship. But there is a trap even here. The same number can fall into overlapping ranges. Sometimes one value can correspond to different relationships, a first cousin or a great aunt or uncle. It's probability, not a single answer. And here's a mini fact that oddly relieves the tension while making it even more real. The centimorgan is named after Thomas Hunt Morgan, the geneticist who built early inheritance maps on fruit flies. In the 21st century, people find sisters and fathers using a unit that was born in a lab full of flies. But there's another side to it. Sometimes a match in your relatives list doesn't feel like a reunion. It feels like impact. Writer Dani Shapiro grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family and was very close to her father. For years, people around her hinted that she didn't resemble him and even questioned her connection to the family. In 2016, she took a DNA test almost casually, and the result felt unexpected, roughly half Eastern European Ashkenazi and roughly half Western European. Then a close match appeared, listed as a first cousin, someone the family did not recognize. She began checking records, asking questions, and following what evidence she could find. And slowly, the truth came into focus. One of the closest relationships in her life wasn't what she believed.
I learned that I had been conceived in an institute in Philadelphia, and that my biological father had been a sperm donor.
And then you realize this technology is not only science, it can be a psychological detonation because sometimes it doesn't add a story, it changes the foundation you were standing on. A secret that used to be taken to the grave now lives in someone else's match list.
That was the night that my life changed.
And at this point, the story turns towards something people rarely think about when they buy a kit for fun. Under the clean interface of maps and percentages, there is a raw data layer.
At-home tests usually work like this. They check tiny markers in your DNA, not the whole thing. Think of them as many little checkpoints where people can differ by a single letter. The company reads hundreds of thousands of these markers, often around 700,000, because it's cheaper and faster than reading your entire genome.
700,000 sections where they know there are slight differences or variants among humans.
A lab machine scans a chip to see which version you have at each checkpoint, and then the result is stored in the company's database, owned and controlled by the same company that sold you the kit.
Now here is the bridge line you need to keep in your head for the rest of this film. A kit is a product, a database is infrastructure.
This is where the infrastructure begins, because when investigators have DNA from a crime scene, there are multiple search paths. The first path is access to a private testing company database through cooperation or a court process. The second path is a state database. In the United States, there is a national DNA index tied to the criminal justice system, and in some states, family searching is allowed in those systems. But that database is built from arrested and convicted populations, not normal citizens. If a suspect has no relatives in that system, the search doesn't help much. And then there is a third path that changed the rules. Over time, millions of people uploaded their genetic profiles to genealogy sites to find relatives. What began as a family tool also became an investigative tool. This is genetic genealogy, and it changed forensic work. Investigators can take DNA from a crime scene, convert it into the same kind of markers consumer databases use, and search for relatives already in the system. They don't get a name right away. They get distant matches, then build a family tree until the unknown person comes into focus. Sometimes the suspect is found not because they tested, but because a distant relative did. And there is one more important point. In the United States, forensic genetic genealogy became so sensitive that national guidance was created to set clear limits. It spells out what evidence is allowed, what is off limits, which types of cases qualify, what steps must be followed, and how every lead has to be confirmed. Because without firm boundaries, this turns into a tool that can be used almost anywhere. And that kind of power is easy to misuse.
So this brings up the question most people don't want to sit with. Where does my DNA end and where does our DNA begin?
This is where the familiar notion of privacy starts to collapse. Privacy is no longer individual. It is familial, networked. Because even if you never submitted anything, your cousin can make your genome statistically visible.
The most famous symbol of this world is the Golden State Killer case. In the 1970s and 1980s, a serial offender committed all sorts of murders in California. Investigators had DNA, but for decades they had no name, nothing to match it to. Then, in 2018, the breakthrough happens. Investigators use distant familial matching. They don't find an exact person, but they find relatives, third cousins and beyond. They build a tree, narrow the circle, and then confirm using the classic forensic standard, the STR profile, to reach a specific individual.
They say this is their man, Joseph D'Angelo, now 72, arrested outside his home. They surprised him.
It's impressive and it's scary, because now your DNA is not only yours. If a distant relative uploads their data to an open site, that one choice can help an investigation and still pull you in, even if you never agreed. To understand the scale, it helps to look at a case where this method solved a cold case not as a legend, but as a routine procedure. Two young Canadians, Jay Cook, who was 20 years old, and his girlfriend Tanya van Keulenborg, who was 18, traveled from a suburb of Victoria to the Seattle area to run a simple family errand. Days later, Tanya's body is found near a roadside. 2 days after that, miles away, Jay's body is found as well. Investigators have one crucial thing to work with: the offender's DNA. But for decades, that profile doesn't match anyone in police records.
Here you need to separate two DNA languages. I first ran into this distinction years ago in a university forensic course. And it matters more now than ever. Classic forensic work often relies on STR tests, short repeating patterns. They are the gold standard for confirming one person in a court, but they don't help much when there is no direct match to compare against. Consumer databases work differently. They are built around S&P markets, small checkpoints spread across DNA. They don't confirm a person, they point to relatives by spotting long shared stretches, even when the connection is distant.
Then comes the slow part, where it's mostly digging through records until one name fits the tree. But they still need court-grade proof, so they confirm it with an STR match. Once that match is in place, the case moves fast, and William Earl Talbot II is arrested and later sentenced to 2 life terms. and it becomes a symbol of a new world. Sometimes it's enough that someone in your family, even a very distant someone, once clicked upload.
The genetic genealogy community deserves a recognition. Their advancements and analytics are what helped get us to this stage.
And here's a mini fact for anyone who likes the absurdity of reality. Medicine contains rare cases of chimerism. For example, after a bone marrow transplant, where a person can end up with mixed genetic profiles in different tissues. It's uncommon, but the existence of it alone is a reminder that DNR is not always the simple label people imagine. Now add one more real detail that makes this personal. In Texas, there was a cold case. In the late 1970s, a young woman's body was found. For decades, her name was unknown. In 2021, she was identified as 14 years old Sherry Ann Jarvis. And it happened not because she took a test, but through the genealogical pathway, family matches, and a tree. This is the new ethical front line: privacy, access, control, and who pays the price for new capabilities. And if you think this is only about police, that's only half the picture, because the other half is data economics.
DNA testing is a billion-dollar business, and the model rarely ends at sell a kit and you're done. The real value lives in the data library, in the scale of the database, in the bundle of genome plus surveys plus family trees plus matches. That's why when you're offered for $99 learn the truth about yourself, you are buying more than a report, you are financing a database.
Then the business splits into two paths. One path is research and deals with Big Pharma. In 2018, 23andMe announced a partnership with GlaxoSmithKline, with roughly $300 million involved and access to a genetic database for drug discovery. From the science side, this can look like pure gold, because it helps connect genetic variants to symptoms, disease risk, and how people respond to treatments.
So we said that drug discovery can fundamentally change if you have an incredible amount of data.
From the consumer side, it looks more blunt. You pay for the kit, you generate the data, and that data becomes an asset. And in most cases, the profits from that asset do not flow back to the person who provided it.
Customers may not be prepared to share that highly personal information with third-party companies.
Public reporting has suggested that more than 80% of 23andMe customers agreed to let their data be used for research. On a human level, that can feel like doing something good, like contributing to science. But on a market level, it can mean something else. A future medicine might be built partly on that database and then sold under normal pharma economics, with big margins. And the uncomfortable point stays the same. The person who provided the raw material is usually not the one who shares in the upside. The second direction is health and risk. This is where the stakes are highest, because errors in ancestry are social confusion, but errors in health can become decisions about surgery, medication, fear, and the future. The problem is that most consumer health tests are still the same sampled as in Pedalea, not full sequencing. Take a common example. Doctors often talk about certain genes when they discuss breast and ovarian cancer risk, but it is not one simple switch: you either have or you do not. There are many different risky variants. Most home tests only check a small slice of them. That is why a flagged result still needs confirmation in a clinical lab, and a low-risk result can simply mean the test did not check the specific variant that matters for you. So here is what every honest professional has to say. A consumer test can be a useful signal, but it is not comprehensive medical screening. It does not cover the whole gene, it does not cover all variants, and it does not replace clinical diagnostics and a doctor, especially when the topic is serious disease.
Now we reach the layer that has become too real to ignore in recent years: data security and the fate of companies. Genetic data is not a password. You cannot reset it once it leaks. This is why leaks, bankruptcies, sales and mergers in this sector feel different than in any other. You can cancel a bank card. You cannot cancel your DNA.
In 2018, MyHeritage acknowledged a breach involving tens of millions of accounts. Then, in the autumn of 2023, another story exploded with 23andMe. At first, the company reported about 14,000 accounts compromised through credential stuffing, the oldest trick on the modern internet, when people reuse the same passwords across sites.
The company says that data belonging to nearly 7 million users
has been impacted. According to reports,
And then it became clear why DNA platforms are different. The account is not just an account, it is a doorway into a relatives graph. Through the DNA relatives feature, attackers could expand access to connected profiles tied to millions. Put simply, a small number of compromised logins became a viewing corridor into a much larger network. And the key point is simple. It was not a full genetic file. It was the social layer around it, and that layer can be even more dangerous. Names, birth years, locations, family links, match percentages, ancestry reports, and relationship labels. It is the layer that turns biology into an identity you can search, sort, and connect. And here the story runs into something that sounds like tech, but is really law. In the cloud era, where the servers sit often matters less than who controls access. A company can be registered in one place, run the brand from another, use a lab in a third, and store data somewhere else entirely. When things reach court, the key point is usually not the dot on the map. The key point is who has real power over the system and its access rules.
And now we get a very modern detail, the language of regulators. When a breach happens in the genetics industry, it stops being a moral argument. It becomes numbers in regulatory decisions. That matters because it means the state is starting to speak to DNA businesses not through outrage, but through sanctions.
On June 5, 2025, the UK data protection regulator issued a penalty notice with that £2.3 million number connected to the 2023 incident. It's one of the rare cases where genetic privacy was expressed not as emotion, but as a punishment figure.
Today, we have issued a fine of £2.31 million to 23andMe for failing to implement appropriate security measures to protect the personal information of UK users.
But a fine is only the surface. The next layer is bankruptcy. 23andMe files for Chapter 11, and suddenly the market sees the simple truth behind the mission talk. The most valuable part of the company is the database. Then the sale process starts. And the prices discussed are not small, they are in the hundreds of millions. It is a reminder that in a data business, the crown jewel is usually not the lab. It is the data library. And you can feel the mood change. This stops being a normal data breach story, like a bank card that you can cancel and replace. It turns into something colder. People want their biology back. That is why, in 2025, the California Attorney General urged 23andMe customers to delete their data and destroy their samples if they did not want the database transferred to a new owner. It is a new kind of consumer panic, because this is data you cannot reissue. Against that backdrop, another uncomfortable fact appears: a legal gap. Many people assume they are protected by medical confidentiality, but direct-to-consumer genetic services are often not medical providers in the legal sense of traditional medical privacy laws. In the US, for example, HIPAA protects medical data held by doctors, hospitals, and insurers, but it does not automatically cover companies selling at-home kits. There is also the 2008 GINA law, which prohibits discrimination based on genetic information in health insurance and employment, but it has limits. And here is a mini fact that sounds dry, but hits reality. Even where genetics is protected inside work and health insurance, other types of insurance can operate under different regimes. So your genome can become not only science and identity drama, it can become the economics of risk. In Europe, the general data protection rules treat genetic data as a special, highly sensitive category. But even with strong rules on paper, the real question stays practical. How consent is shown to you? Who gets access? How deletion really works? And whether penalties actually change behavior.
That leads to another risk layer, and it's not a hack, it's a change in the rules. Companies can rewrite policies, get bought, or go bankrupt. So even if you agreed to one set of terms, you can end up under another. And then the hard part becomes practical, not philosophical. How do you know your data was truly deleted? How do you know the physical sample was actually destroyed? And how do you know copies did not spread into partner systems?
Here is a small detail that feels almost technical, but it plays like a thriller. Some open genealogy sites made law enforcement searching an opt-in feature, so participation depends on one checkbox in your settings. But that checkbox lives inside the product, and products can change wording, change meaning, and change defaults with an update. Sometimes the law stays the same. The interface is what changes. Regulators respond in targeted ways. The US Federal Trade Commission has publicly stated that genetic data is among the most sensitive categories of information and has demanded that companies keep their promises about storage and deletion, especially during bankruptcies and after breaches. And this industry has seen cases where the state didn't come for sensational scandals, but for basic discipline, how sensitive data is stored, whether promises match reality, and whether rules can be rewritten retroactively. Now, let's return to where we started. 2 sisters and 10% France. This isn't an error exactly. It's a reminder that those percentages are not blood, not essence. They are a model built on recombination randomness, limited marker sets, the composition of reference panels, and the historical mobility of populations. One more detail is both cool and a bit creepy. Some tests also mention Neanderthals. They might say you have about 2% of that ancient lineage in your DNA. This happens because the test finds tiny pieces in your genome that match fragments scientists have mapped from old remains. Long ago, some human groups mixed with these ancient relatives. Small traces can still show up in many people today. But you can't link it to one specific individual. It's too far back in time, and it has been reshuffled across many generations.
So again, DNA tests can be accurate, but people often hear the result in the wrong way. The test is only saying this: part of your DNA are similar to modern reference group. It doesn't tell you your full identity or your full story.
So here's the practical part. If your goal is to find relatives, this tool can work incredibly well. But when you turn on matching, you're joining a network that can affect people connected to you. If your goal is Ancestry, treat the percentages like a map, not a verdict. Think big regions, not tiny slices. And remember, borders on a screen are not borders in DNA. If your goal is health, don't treat a consumer test as a final medical answer. It can flag risk, but serious questions need a doctor and clinical testing. And understand the price. It's not only money, it's a decision about data you can't replace and trust you can't easily take back.
That's the dilemma. This tag can give you answers and take away your right to a secret, because sometimes to find yourself, you first have to hand yourself over to a system. Thanks for watching. This was Dr. Claus. If you want more films about the hidden side of tech and the rules that run our lives, I'll put a couple on screen now. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.